This is Mr. Coates, and this is APES lecture number 36 on agriculture and the land. We just got done talking about where our food comes from, the types of crops that are out there, and some of the modifications we make to those crops. Now we're going to talk a little bit about what those crops do to the actual land themselves. And one of the first things we're going to look at is soil. This is a picture of, obviously this is a field up here, and you can see that it's got a large gully in the middle of it here, and this is a classic example of erosion, and farming is one of the worst practices we can do when it comes to conserving soil. It really disrupts soils, it breaks soils up, and really creates an erosion problem. We're going to talk a little bit about some of those things we can do to prevent erosion and prevent soil degradation. Now, what is soil? Soil, a lot of people just call it dirt, but soil is basically a mixture of all kinds of different things. Could be some organic material in it. There's obviously minerals, particle size is important, things like that. So what is soil? When we look at soils, there's often layers of soils. If you ever dig down deep into the earth, you can see these different layers. Florida is kind of different than this diagram here, but because of our sandy soils. In other places, you usually have pretty good layering as you go down. So scientists have named these layers what we call horizons. So it's a good idea to know what these horizons are. One of the first horizons is the O horizon, and the O horizon is not really soil per se. It's not yet soil anyway. It's usually made up of a lot of leaf matter, a lot of organic matter that's not quite totally decayed. So that layer of either thatch or leaves that are on top of the soil, that's the O horizon. Once we get underneath that, we get the A horizon. The A horizon is what we call the topsoil, and this is usually where all the nutrients are locked up in the soil. It has what we call humus in it, and humus is mostly decayed organic material at this point. Also, the A horizon is where most of the life lives in the soil. This is where you find the plant roots, you find worms, all kinds of insects that live in this area. In the Midwest, this is the most fertile layer. It's usually dark black in the Midwest. After that, we get into an area called the E horizon. Now, the E horizon is also known as a zone of leaching. And this is because as rainwater percolates down through the A horizon, it brings down some of the nutrients and some of the minerals that are in that. And it brings it down to this next layer, and those things get stopped in this layer here. After that, we get the B horizon. B horizon usually is heavier materials like iron. It has usually a clay layer, sometimes aluminum, that all come down as well from the above, but they're usually the heavier parts that get leached down to this part. After that, we get to the C horizon. The C horizon is basically parent material, which is the bedrock material that's been broken up into smaller pieces, maybe pebble size or smaller sand grain size here. And it's been partially altered parent material. And then the R horizon is known as bedrock down here. In Florida, our bedrock is all limestone. In other places, it could be something like granite. You need to know these horizons. The most important ones are the O horizon, the A horizon, and the E horizon. Now, another property of soil is texture. Soil is usually made up of three different types of texture. You have sand, which is usually the most coarse. You have silt, which is the next coarse. And then you have the most fine, which is clay. And so your soil texture is based on these three components. You can then determine your soil texture based on what we call the fractions of those different types, clay, silt, and sand. And we use what we call a soil texture triangle, and that's what this thing is down here, and to figure out how soil what the texture is based on how the soil separates. Now, for farming, the loam soil, which is this part right here, the loam soil, is your best type of soil texture. It provides the right amount of support for roots, the right amount of pore space, which we'll get to a little bit later, and holds the right amount of water for crops. Now, as I mentioned, this soil triangle is pretty important. You need to know how to use it. It's fairly easy to use. It looks complex, but you need to realize it's really not that complex. What they'll do is that we'll give you a percentage of each one of these: clay, silt, and sand. And we'll say, based on that, what kind of soil do you have? And basically all you have to do is figure out how to read this. So let's say that we have a 20% clay, we have a 60% silt, and a 20% sand. Alright, so the first thing you want to do is go over here to percent of clay, and you want to go to 20, and clay is read horizontally. Clay is read horizontally, so this is a 20% line, so we'll follow that all the way over here. And then the next thing we want to do is go over here to silt. Silt is read diagonally going from the upper right to lower left. So we go to our 60 right here, and this is our 60 line right here. So we'll come down like this. And then where they cross should be about where the rest of that sand comes, which is right there at that 20. So sand is at the bottom down here, percent of sand, and sand goes from lower right to upper left. And so where they cross right in this area here is what type of soil we have. So in this case, we have silty loam with this percentage here, silty loam. So once again, you should be able to use this soil triangle and figure out how to do that. It's not hard to do. You just have to remember that clay goes horizontal, silt goes diagonally from upper right to lower left, and sand goes from our lower right to upper left. So make sure you know how to use the soil triangle. Soil porosity is another measurement of the texture of the soil. It measures the number of pores between the soil particles. So we look at clay here, and if we were a drop of water and we were to trace our path down here, we could go down this path here, we could go down this path here. There's probably about 100 different paths here we could start out with. However, if we have sand, then we can only go down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Very few compared to clay. So in this case, and this is a little bit confusing, we say that clay has a high porosity because of the number of pore spaces between the grains, whereas sand has a low porosity. All right, and so like I said, that's kind of confusing because the pores are actually bigger in the sand. However, because they're bigger, they can't hold as much water. With clay, the pores are small and numerous. They can hold a lot of water. So porosity is also a measurement of how much water the soil can hold. So just remember that porosity is the number of pores the soil has. There's another measurement that we use as well called permeability. Now permeability is the ability of how fast water flows through a soil. So this actually has an opposite relationship to porosity. The higher the porosity, like in clay, the lower permeability. This means water does not flow very well through clay. It gets stuck in between the granules in the pores, but can't go any further. Whereas sand has a very high permeability because water flows right through it. These two measurements are really one of the most important things about soils, and like I said, porosity is a little confusing, but it's just the inverse of permeability. So if you remember that clay is the least pervious, that means it has a high porosity. Now, how can we damage soils? A lot of different ways. Once again, I said farming is one of the worst things we can do to soil. Every time we plow up a field, we introduce the possibility of erosion. So we can have all kinds of different wind erosion. We can have water erosion. This photo here is from the Dust Bowl back in the 1930s. Soils in the Midwest had been depleted of any kind of life. They couldn't grow crops anymore, and it got very hot. We had a long drought. No plants grew, and so we had these huge dust storms that removed tons and tons of soil out of the Midwest, and basically that was a type of erosion, and it was a severe problem for the United States. It actually kind of created the Great Depression, or at least made it worse. Desertification. Desertification is when soils can no longer support life. So if the soil gets to a point where it cannot support plant life anymore, we call that desertification. It doesn't necessarily have to be in a desert location. It's just in an area that can't support any kind of plant life. A lot of times when we have areas that get a lot of water, but also it's irrigated with groundwater, we get what we call salinization. And this is when the irrigated water has different salts dissolved in it. And these aren't the salts I'm talking about that we put on our French fries. These are calcium-based salts. But basically those salts will be left behind and during evaporation, and it will make the soil infertile. You see this area here of white with this exposed salts that don't let any plants grow. Other things we do is that we over-irrigate, and sometimes when we do that and we have an impervious layer right underneath our topsoil, like a clay layer, we can flood our topsoil, and this is called waterlogging, and a lot of plants don't like their roots very wet. And so you can kill plants very easily by overwatering them when you don't have good drainage. The other thing is just overuse of the soil. We just basically keep on using the soil and using it, keep on planting new crops in it, and we don't let it rest for a while, and that will definitely create problems for soil in short term. Global soil erosion is also a problem. We talked about problems in the United States, but also globally, huge problems of soil erosion, especially in those areas near deserts like this area here. A lot of areas that have high intensity farming have problems with soil erosion, mountainous areas as well. In the United States, we have some serious problems because most of our country has issues with soil erosion. What are some of those ways? Well, a couple things that farmers can do. Contour planting and strip cropping. Basically, what they've done here is that they plow and plant perpendicular to the slope. So the slope of the land goes down this way, and they plow and plant that goes perpendicular to that slope. And when it rains, then the water hits these rows and gets stopped. Slope keeps on going this way as well, down this way. And so this is called contour planting, and you do this usually on gentle slopes. And also, this is strip cropping. What they've done is that they have different crops in long strips. So they have a wheat crop here, and then maybe a bean crop, and then it looks like they got something else in here, maybe a corn crop in here. And so you have 3 different crops in the same field, and those provide different strips, get harvested at different times, and so they don't allow soil runoff. You can also do terracing, especially in areas with very steep mountainsides. This is that yellow rice I was talking about, but these are planted in terraces on a hillside. So each one of these terraces here prevents soil erosion from occurring down the hillside here where it's really steep. Another good way to do it is what we call conservation tillage. This is when you don't plow the field at all. In this case, the field is left unplowed, so this is a leftover crop here. It looks like some kind of wheat. And then they have a special type of planter that actually just disturbs a little bit of the soil and inserts and injects seeds into the soil as it goes. So you got these little injectors that put seeds right into the ground, so you don't have to plow and till up the soil. And the leftover roots from all this old wheat here hold the soil in place until the new plants pop up. And that is actually the best type of tilling you can do on your farm. And the soils will stay healthy for a long period of time if you practice that. Now, other things we come up to in order to produce more food is creating monocultures. I mentioned this earlier in our food lecture. A monoculture is basically when we have very little genetic diversity in the crop. It's all the same plant. Sometimes it might even be clones of the same plant. Very low habitat diversity and very little species diversity happen in a monoculture in some of those. Problem is that you want your crop to actually act as an ecosystem. That way it can kind of manage itself. And unfortunately this doesn't work, but we're starting to learn now that if we manage our crops as what we call agro-ecosystems, which is try and plant several different things in them, then we can avoid problems with habitat loss, species diversity problems, and monocultures. So what are some of the ways we can do that? I already mentioned one, strip cropping. So we have a strip of wheat here, a strip of beans, a strip of corn, and another strip of wheat. And so this provides, these 3 different plants provide some more biodiversity for this farm. So it's not just a monoculture anymore. And remember, we said in the past, biodiversity is a good thing. The higher your biodiversity, the better. We can also do what we call agroforestry, where you plant the crops in between banks of trees. Now this can also help with soil erosion because the trees block wind. In this case, you have organisms that live in these trees like birds and things like that, and then they will come down here and feed in your crops and eat insects and help you manage your crop. And so you can plant all kinds of different crops in here. You could even do strip planting in between the trees, and you could do both strip or intercropping and agroforestry at the same time. Now, in most small farming operations, like farming in your backyard, you have what we call polyculture. And this is when you plant different plants next to each other all over the place. So there's no rhyme or reason to the way you plant. Now, obviously, we can't do this in industrial agriculture because it's too hard to harvest this type of crop. But for a home garden, this is the best way to do it. So you plant some broccoli up here. In the back here, there might be some type of squash, and then there's some corn back here. You might have some herbs back here, basil or whatever. And so you have all kinds of different plants in here. These things provide a lot of biodiversity for a lot of critters that might help you manage pests in your crop there. Well, that's all I have about agriculture today. Bring your questions into class and we'll talk about it in class.